Missouri. December 2011. A young woman drives away from her family home on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. A few hours later, her SUV is found abandoned across the Mississippi River in East St. Louis. Her purse, her identification, her glasses, personal items that suggest she planned to come back, remain in the vehicle. The woman herself is nowhere to be found. This is the case of Phoenix Lucille Coldon. Welcome to the Cold Case Archive. We unlock the files of the lost and the forgotten, examine the evidence that remains, and keep these names from being erased. If you want to keep these stories alive, subscribe now and join us as we reopen the vault on unsolved cases from across the country. Phoenix Lucille Coldon was 23 years old at the time she disappeared. She was the only daughter of Lawrence and Goldia Coldon. Those who knew her remember a young woman with multiple interests and a steady presence in her family's life. Someone described by relatives and acquaintances as talented, disciplined, and devoted to her loved ones. Phoenix grew up in Spanish Lake, Missouri, a suburban community northeast of St. Louis. To the Coldons, Spanish Lake represented stability, a place where neighbors knew one another, where Sunday services were a weekly anchor, and where family life moved at a rhythm that felt safe and steady. From an early age, Phoenix stood out. She was musically gifted, often filling the family home with the sound of piano. She was also a skilled athlete, competing in fencing, a sport that demanded not only physical ability but also strategy, focus, and discipline. Hours of practice at the keyboard, long sessions on the fencing floor, these were the marks of her determination. Phoenix had many talents and was still shaping what her adult future might look like. After high school, she enrolled at the University of Missouri, St. Louis before later attending community college. Like many young people her age, she was still searching for the right direction, balancing independence with the structure of home life. To her friends, Phoenix was kind, ambitious, and outgoing. To her parents, she was their daughter, raised with guidance, discipline, and faith. Lawrence and Goldia were protective. Their faith shaped their home, with church playing a central role in family life. Phoenix was homeschooled for part of her education, and her parents remained closely involved in her routines. That structure sometimes felt restrictive as Phoenix moved further into adulthood, but it was built on care and devotion. Behind the familiar family routines, though, were parts of Phoenix's life her parents didn't fully see. Relationships, friendships, and private thoughts would only surface after her disappearance, adding complexity to her story. Sunday, December 18, 2011 began like so many others in the Coldon household. Phoenix and her mother attended church in the morning, then stopped for groceries before returning home. Back at the house, Phoenix changed into casual clothes, sweatpants and a hoodie, and went outside to shoot basketballs in the driveway. It was the kind of simple, ordinary activity her parents had seen countless times before. Around 3 p.m., Phoenix walked to her black 1998 Chevrolet Blazer, got in, and drove away. Her father, Lawrence, noticed her leave. To him, there was no sign of anything unusual. Phoenix often ran short errands. There was no reason to expect anything different that afternoon. But this time she didn't come back. As evening came, the unease grew heavier. Phone calls went unanswered. Friends had not seen her. For Lawrence and Goldia, the ordinary security of their Sunday routine was suddenly replaced by a silence they could not explain. Meanwhile, across the Mississippi River in East St. Louis, a different scene was unfolding. Later that day, authorities discovered Phoenix's Blazer abandoned. Reports about its condition would vary. Some accounts suggested the engine was running, the keys still in the ignition, and the driver's door open. Others described the SUV as shut off and secured. What remained consistent was that Phoenix's belongings were still inside: her purse, identification, and glasses, items she would not likely leave behind willingly. But Phoenix herself was missing. For the Coldons, the situation became even more painful when they learned the SUV had been impounded, yet they were not immediately notified. Nearly 2 weeks passed before the family discovered their daughter's vehicle had been located and held across the river. Those lost days deepened their anguish and strained their trust in the systems that were supposed to help them. The Coldons' home community, Spanish Lake, was a place of contrasts. Quiet residential streets sat not far from busy industrial corridors and highways. Life there often felt routine, safe, and familiar. That contrast made Phoenix's disappearance, and her SUV turning up in East St. Louis, a city struggling with crime and poverty, all the more disorienting. Over time, Details emerged that painted a more complicated picture of Phoenix's life than her parents had known. She had been using multiple phones, kept in contact with people outside her parents' awareness, and carried parts of her world in private. These details didn't explain her disappearance, but they widened the questions. Had she left willingly? Had she been planning a new path her parents didn't know about? Or had she encountered danger in the hours after she drove away? For her parents, each revelation was both painful and necessary. They realized they had only known part of the life their daughter was living. Investigators sifted through phone records, financial transactions, and testimonies. The family hired private investigators and pursued every lead, determined to find answers. The facts of that day remain stark. A 23-year-old woman left her family's home on a Sunday afternoon. By evening, her Blazer was found abandoned in East St. Louis with her belongings inside. Days passed before her family learned the vehicle had been recovered. Behind those facts is the deeper reality: a family devastated by uncertainty, an investigation complicated by jurisdictional boundaries, and a community shaken by the disappearance of a young woman with so much potential. That moment, Phoenix pulling away from her driveway, remains the hinge of the story. It was ordinary, unnoticed at the time, but it became the beginning of a mystery that continues to this day. By the evening of December 18, 2011, the Coldons were already uneasy. Phoenix had been gone for hours without a word. Her phone calls went unanswered and she hadn't checked in with friends. Lawrence and Goldia paced their Spanish Lake home, wondering where their daughter could be. Unbeknownst to them, just across the Mississippi River, Phoenix's black 1998 Chevy Blazer was already sitting abandoned in East St. Louis, Illinois. The SUV was found parked near 9th Street and St. Clair Avenue. It wasn't hidden down a side road or tucked into a remote lot. It was right out in the open, as if someone had pulled up, stepped out, and never returned. Inside were Phoenix's belongings: her purse, her driver's license, her glasses, her shoes. All items no young woman would typically walk away from. For her family, the later revelation was crushing. These weren't things Phoenix would ever willingly leave behind. Some accounts claimed the keys were still in the ignition, the engine humming when the Blazer was first noticed. Others said the vehicle was already off when police arrived. What remained consistent was this: the SUV was there, Phoenix was not, and the objects she needed most were left inside. To the Coldons, who didn't yet know the vehicle had been found, the hours dragged on in confusion. They assumed law enforcement would quickly connect the dots between a missing woman in Missouri and an abandoned vehicle just across the bridge in Illinois. But that connection didn't come swiftly. The SUV was towed away soon after it was located. At first, authorities did not treat it as a crime scene. It was processed like any other abandoned vehicle in East St. Louis, a city where such calls were routine. The family wasn't notified immediately. Days later, when Lawrence and Goldia finally learned that Phoenix's Blazer had been sitting in an impound lot, their worry turned into anger. From their perspective, the system had failed them from the start. The location itself only deepened the mystery. East St. Louis had a reputation. Once a thriving industrial hub, by 2011 it had suffered decades of decline. Jobs were scarce, neighborhoods were struggling, and violent crime rates were among the highest in the country. For years, national outlets had ranked it as one of America's most dangerous cities. To Lawrence and Goldia, the thought of their daughter being stranded there was terrifying. Spanish Lake, where the Coldons lived, was a suburban community. East St. Louis, across the Mississippi, was not part of Phoenix's routine life. She didn't work there, study there, or socialize there. The Coldons could not think of a single reason she would have driven to that area voluntarily. The discovery of the Blazer should have been a turning point, the place where the search for Phoenix gained focus. Instead, it marked the beginning of a struggle. Because Phoenix had vanished in Missouri, but her vehicle was found in Illinois, 2 different states and 2 different law enforcement agencies were now linked to the case. That meant overlapping jurisdictions, divided resources, and confusion about who should lead the investigation. Goldia later said these jurisdictional issues, combined with the way her daughter's disappearance was initially handled, felt like a dismissal. She believed that if Phoenix had been someone else, perhaps a white woman from a wealthier community, authorities might have moved faster, treated the SUV like a crime scene, and launched immediate ground searches. Instead, critical time slipped away. The Blazer itself became a haunting symbol. A car left in plain sight, personal belongings untouched, its driver missing without explanation. It demanded answers. Did Phoenix drive it there herself? Did she meet someone? Was she forced out? Did something happen before the car even reached East St. Louis? The questions mounted, but the answers never came. For the Coldons, the experience was unbearable. They had watched their daughter pull out of the driveway that Sunday afternoon, and now they were told her SUV had been discovered in one of the most dangerous areas of the region. To make matters worse, by the time they even learned about it, the car had already been towed, processed, and handled in a way that may have compromised evidence. Lawrence, a father who had always prided himself on protecting his family, could not shake the feeling that he had failed his daughter in her moment of need. Goldia, who had been with Phoenix just hours earlier at church, was tormented by the thought that her child might have been in trouble while she sat unaware at home. In the days following the discovery, the family threw themselves into action. They made phone calls, distributed flyers, and pleaded with authorities to prioritize Phoenix's case. They weren't content to wait. They knew the longer their daughter was missing, the harder it would be to find her. But despite their determination, the trail was already going cold. East St. Louis in 2011 was a difficult environment for any investigation. Local police were stretched thin, often dealing with a flood of violent crimes and a shortage of resources. Even cases involving homicide sometimes struggled for attention in such conditions. For a missing person case tied to a vehicle impound, the urgency wasn't there in the way the Coldons felt it should have been. This gap, between what the family expected and what actually happened, created wounds that never fully healed. Every delay, every unanswered question, every jurisdictional hurdle only deepened their sense of isolation. For the Coldons, the SUV wasn't just an abandoned car. It was the last known trace of their daughter, a clue that should have been handled with care. Instead, it became a symbol of lost opportunities, of what might have been uncovered if only those first hours had been treated differently. The abandoned Blazer didn't solve the mystery of Phoenix's disappearance. It only widened it. And as the family searched for answers, they would begin to uncover another side of Phoenix's life, one they hadn't fully known, and one that raised even more questions about what might have happened to her. When Phoenix Coldon's black Chevy Blazer was discovered abandoned in East St. Louis, her family assumed the investigation would accelerate. A missing young woman, a vehicle full of personal belongings, and a city with one of the highest crime rates in the nation. It seemed like a situation that demanded urgency. But in the hours and days after December 18, 2011, Lawrence and Goldia Coldon realized they would be left to do much of the searching themselves. At first they held on to hope. Lawrence drove for hours across St. Louis and into neighboring communities, retracing possible routes, looking for any sign of his daughter. Goldia worked the phones, calling friends, relatives, and church members, repeating the same questions. Had anyone seen Phoenix? Did anyone know where she went? They printed flyers, passed them out at gas stations, grocery stores, and churches. They knocked on doors. They contacted local news outlets, hoping to see Phoenix's photo on television screens. But the story didn't immediately gain traction. In those first crucial days, coverage was minimal. The Coldons would later say they felt ignored, that their daughter's disappearance wasn't given the same urgency as others in the region. Goldia in particular believed race played a role. A young black woman from Spanish Lake simply did not receive the same attention as missing women from other backgrounds. As the end of December passed, the family's frustration grew. They felt trapped between two jurisdictions, with Missouri handling the missing person report and Illinois holding the abandoned SUV. The confusion slowed communication, and no single agency seemed to take full responsibility. By January 2012, weeks after Phoenix vanished, the case was no closer to resolution. That month, the family held vigils and prayer services, urging the public not to forget. They gave interviews hoping to spark awareness. Lawrence often stood with Phoenix's photo in his hands, telling reporters, "She's not a runaway. Something happened to my daughter." As investigators dug deeper, details about Phoenix's life began to surface, details her parents had not fully known. Phoenix had always been bright, disciplined, and deeply involved in her family's church community. She was a musician, a fencer, and a student. On the surface, her future seemed steady. But beneath that, she had been navigating a more complicated reality. At the time of her disappearance, Phoenix was enrolled at St. Louis Community College. Some reports indicated she hadn't been attending classes regularly. Friends revealed that she had been in a relationship, one she hadn't shared openly with her parents. Others described Phoenix as someone who occasionally pushed against her parents' strict rules, craving independence and privacy. The Coldons, who had believed they knew every aspect of their daughter's life, were stunned by these revelations. It was not that Phoenix had been living a double life in a sinister sense. Rather, like many young adults, she was learning to separate her private world from her family's expectations. She had grown up in a structured household, rooted in faith, routine, and close parental oversight. As she entered her 20s, she wanted to explore independence. Some acquaintances claimed Phoenix had even considered moving out. If true, that possibility opened difficult questions. Had she left home on December 18th with plans to start fresh? Or had someone exploited her desire for independence and lured her into danger? For Goldia, the idea that her daughter would have simply run away never fit. She pointed to the SUV as proof. If Phoenix left voluntarily, why would she leave behind her purse, her glasses, her shoes? She asked. To her, the evidence suggested coercion, not choice. Still, investigators had to examine every angle. If Phoenix had been in a secret relationship, where was that person on the day she vanished? If she had been considering a move, who knew about it? If she had missed classes, what had she been doing with her time? The answers weren't clear, and the longer it took to find them, the colder the trail became. By spring of 2012, the Coldons were battling not just grief but also narrative. Alongside their appeals for help, unverified claims began to circulate. Some suggested Phoenix had fallen into dangerous circles. Others speculated she had led a hidden lifestyle unknown to her parents. Most of these claims were never substantiated, but they spread quickly, complicating how the public perceived the case. The family was devastated by this shift. Instead of focusing solely on finding Phoenix, they found themselves defending her character. They reminded the public that she was a daughter, a friend, and a young woman with talents and dreams. As the months passed, the Coldons fought to keep the story alive. They held additional vigils, spoke at community events, and appeared on radio programs. Slowly, their persistence began to draw wider attention. By late 2012, national outlets had begun to take notice. Phoenix's case was featured on television programs dedicated to missing persons. Later, investigative series and documentaries would revisit her disappearance, highlighting the many unanswered questions. But for Lawrence and Goldia, the shift in attention was bittersweet. It meant more people finally knew Phoenix's name, but it also underscored how long they had been forced to carry the search on their own. Through it all, one truth remained constant. The abandoned Blazer in East St. Louis was not the mark of a planned escape. It was a sign that something had gone terribly wrong. And yet, with every new detail that emerged about Phoenix's private life, the narrative grew more tangled. Was her disappearance tied to her personal relationships? To her desire for independence? Or was she simply the victim of random violence in a city where too many crimes went unsolved? The Coldons had no answers, only questions, prayers, and determination. By the end of the first year, Phoenix's case stood at a difficult crossroads. The family had pressed every lead, spoken to anyone who would listen, and opened themselves to painful truths about their daughter's hidden struggles. But even with those efforts, the mystery remained intact. As the Coldons braced for a second year without their daughter, the investigation began to pivot. Witnesses came forward with claims of sightings. Theories multiplied, some credible, others speculative. And with each one, the line between fact and rumor grew thinner. It was in this next stage that the case of Phoenix Coldon would transform from a family tragedy into one of Missouri's most haunting unsolved mysteries. As the first year of Phoenix Coldon's disappearance gave way to the second, the landscape of the case shifted. The once urgent search had slowed, official updates were scarce, and into that silence poured speculation. Theories about what had happened to the 23-year-old multiplied, some grounded in hard realities, others drifting into conjecture. At the heart of every discussion, however, was one constant: the black 1998 Chevy Blazer that Phoenix had been driving on the day she disappeared. It was the most tangible piece of evidence investigators and her family possessed. Found in East St. Louis, idling with the keys still in the ignition and her belongings inside, the SUV became both a starting point and a symbol of all that was unknown. To some, it represented an abduction interrupted in motion. To others, it hinted at a young woman's attempt to step away from her old life. For the Coldons, it was simply the vehicle that should have carried their daughter safely home, and didn't. The first major theory centered on the possibility of foul play in East St. Louis itself. The city, which has for years recorded crime rates far above the national average, was often cited in discussions about violence and disappearances. For those who believed Phoenix had been the victim of a crime of opportunity, the abandoned SUV was damning evidence. A young woman had been forced out of her car, taken against her will, and never seen again. This line of thought quickly intersected with a darker possibility: human trafficking. Advocates working in the St. Louis region warned that its highways, airports, and central location made it a prime hub for traffickers. Vulnerable women, they argued, could be targeted and moved across state lines before authorities had a chance to react. To Goldia Coldon, this theory was one of the most agonizing. The thought that her daughter could still be alive but trapped, unable to reach out, was a weight she admitted never left her. But the trafficking theory, though widely discussed, had no firm evidence behind it. There were no confirmed sightings of Phoenix in such circumstances, no physical trail to follow. Still, it remained one of the most persistent possibilities, hovering over every conversation about the case. A second theory suggested that Phoenix had left by choice. This perspective pointed to revelations about her life that emerged only after her disappearance. Friends disclosed that she hadn't been attending classes consistently, despite being enrolled in college. Some said she had a boyfriend her parents hadn't known about. Others hinted that she felt stifled by her strict upbringing and had expressed interest in moving out on her own. In this telling, Phoenix's disappearance was not the result of violence but of independence, a drastic decision to separate herself from her old life. The SUV in this version of events was not a crime scene but a deliberate marker, a way of cutting ties. Yet this theory faltered under closer scrutiny. Those who dismissed it pointed out the details that contradicted a planned departure. Phoenix had left behind essentials: her purse, her glasses, her phone. She had withdrawn no money, made no arrangements with friends, and left no note for her family. It was not the pattern of someone carefully preparing to disappear. And as her parents repeatedly asked if she had wanted to start fresh, why would she abandon her only vehicle in a place known for danger? The third theory was the so-called double life. Some commentators, and later even certain media outlets, framed Phoenix as a young woman leading two separate existences. One rooted in her religious family's world of discipline and structure, and another hidden, shaped by personal choices and relationships kept secret. This idea gained traction largely because her parents admitted that in the aftermath of her disappearance, they discovered aspects of her life they hadn't known. But to those who knew Phoenix, the double life framing was unfair. They argued she was simply a young adult navigating boundaries, hardly unusual for someone her age. Still, the phrase stuck. Once repeated in the media, it became a shorthand for mystery, fueling more speculation than fact. Beyond theories, there were the sightings, moments of hope that inevitably dissolved into disappointment. In the weeks and months following her disappearance, tips arrived claiming Phoenix had been seen in East St. Louis, in St. Louis proper, and even in other states. Some reported spotting her in malls, bus stations, or walking on city streets. Each tip sent ripples through her family's circle. Lawrence and Goldia would cling to the possibility, only to learn that none of the reports could be substantiated. Investigators followed up where they could, but no witness accounts were ever confirmed with physical evidence. Surveillance footage failed to verify her presence in any of the locations mentioned. Even more sensational tips, like claims she was living under a new identity, or that she had been forced into exploitative environments, evaporated under scrutiny. For the Coldons, this cycle was excruciating. Each call or message about a possible sighting raised fragile hope, only for it to collapse under the weight of uncertainty. Goldia later described it as emotional whiplash, a constant push and pull between hope and despair. By 2013, Phoenix's case had become a tangle of competing narratives. Online discussions dissected every detail, amplifying unverified claims. Community members debated whether she was a victim of violence, a target of traffickers, or a young woman who had deliberately walked away. Local media continued to cover the case sporadically, but it wasn't until later that national outlets and investigative series began to highlight her story. Through it all, Lawrence and Goldia held firm. They rejected the notion that Phoenix would vanish voluntarily. Lawrence was clear, she didn't just walk away. Somebody took her. Goldia maintained her belief that her daughter was alive, and until evidence proved otherwise, she refused to let hope slip away. Before we continue, we want to take a moment to thank you for following along with this case here on the Cold Case Archive. If you believe these stories matter, please consider subscribing to the channel, turning on notifications, and sharing this video. Your engagement helps us keep attention on cases like Phoenix's, ensuring that families like the Coldons are not left to fight alone. Despite all the theories, none provided resolution. The SUV, running, abandoned, and left with her belongings, remained the strongest and most haunting clue. It was a question mark frozen in time, a scene that suggested something happened abruptly and without Phoenix's consent. As months turned into years, the Coldons fought to keep the search alive. They organized events, spoke to churches and community groups, and gave interviews whenever asked. Slowly, their persistence began to draw larger attention. By the mid-2010s, national television programs and documentaries would take up Phoenix's story, revisiting the SUV, the neighborhood, and the unanswered questions with fresh eyes. Those retellings would shine a spotlight on inconsistencies, overlooked leads, and systemic challenges in how missing person cases were handled. But for the Coldons, it was never about theories, headlines, or speculation. It was about one truth that remained constant. Their daughter was missing and they needed her home. By late 2018, nearly 7 years had passed since Phoenix Coldon vanished from her family's driveway in Spanish Lake, Missouri. For her parents, Lawrence and Goldia, those years were filled with anguish, unanswered questions, and relentless advocacy to keep their daughter's name alive. But outside of their circle, Phoenix's story had received little more than local coverage, overshadowed by other cases. That began to change when national media finally took notice. One of the turning points came with the release of The Disappearance of Phoenix Coldon, a 2-part documentary series aired on the Oxygen Network in December 2018. For the first time, millions of viewers across the United States were introduced to Phoenix's case in an in-depth, structured investigation. The program retraced the timeline from the moment she drove away from her home in Spanish Lake, to the discovery of her abandoned SUV in East St. Louis, and the years of uncertainty that followed. What made the documentary different from earlier coverage was its thoroughness. It presented interviews with her family, close friends, and investigators. It dug into the theories that had long swirled around the case, including the possibility of human trafficking in the St. Louis region, which advocacy groups had identified as a troubling hotspot. It also revealed details that had not been widely discussed before, such as Phoenix's hidden apartment and her growing desire for independence from her parents. These revelations painted a fuller, more complicated picture of her life in the months before she disappeared. For Lawrence and Goldia, watching their daughter's story unfold on national television was both painful and necessary. Painful because it forced them to relive the trauma of her disappearance. Necessary because they hoped that widespread exposure might spark a breakthrough. They believed that somewhere, someone might recognize her face, recall a detail, or step forward with new information. The impact was immediate. People who had never heard Phoenix's name began discussing her case on social media. Online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries lit up with timelines, theories, and debate. Within days, hashtags carrying her name circulated widely in true crime circles. The Coldons were inundated with messages from strangers offering support, sympathy, and in some cases, possible leads. Authorities also received an influx of calls and tips after the Oxygen special aired. None of these tips produced a conclusive lead, but the very fact that the case was being discussed again gave the family some measure of hope. For years, they had felt as if Phoenix's disappearance had been pushed to the margins. Now, for the first time since December 2011, the public conversation was reignited. The Oxygen special also highlighted issues that had long troubled the Coldons. Chief among them was the disparity in media coverage between missing black women and their white counterparts. Advocates have pointed to a pattern often called missing white woman syndrome, where disappearances of young white women dominate headlines while cases involving women of color receive little attention. The Coldons did not hesitate to say they believed Phoenix's story might have been treated differently had she been white. This was not a speculative claim. At the time Phoenix went missing, several other cases involving young white women had received extensive national coverage, with networks devoting hours of airtime and resources to them. Phoenix, by contrast, barely made the local news beyond the initial reporting of her abandoned vehicle. For her parents, this difference was not just a matter of media exposure, it was a matter of urgency. More attention could have meant more leads, faster responses, and possibly a resolution. In interviews following the documentary, Lawrence and Goldia made clear that they were grateful for the attention, but they also expressed frustration that it had taken so long for their daughter's case to be treated with the seriousness it deserved. They believed that Phoenix's story had the power to shed light not only on her own disappearance but also on the systemic issues faced by countless families of missing persons of color. While the Oxygen special succeeded in sparking renewed discussion, it also amplified speculation. Online communities dissected every detail, from the location of the SUV to Phoenix's personal choices. Some commentators focused heavily on the human trafficking angle, pointing to the city's documented struggles with trafficking networks. Others suggested she may have chosen to leave voluntarily, referencing her hidden apartment and her efforts to carve out independence. Still others argued that foul play remained the most likely explanation, pointing to the abruptness of her disappearance and the belongings left inside her vehicle. It is important to stress that despite the breadth of these theories, none have been confirmed. Investigators from the East St. Louis Police Department, St. Louis County Police, and even federal agencies have examined aspects of Phoenix's case, but no official explanation has ever been established. What remains are only possibilities, some grounded in patterns of criminal activity, others based on fragments of her personal life, but all unproven. For the Coldons, this endless cycle of speculation has been both a source of hope and a heavy burden. Each new theory, each message from a stranger, carried with it the possibility of a lead, but also the likelihood of disappointment. Goldia once described the experience as living in a constant state of what-ifs, a phrase that captured the torment of never knowing the truth. Despite the lack of closure, the Coldons have continued to push forward. They became active voices in advocacy for missing persons, particularly missing Black women, using Phoenix's case as both a rallying point and a personal mission. They partnered with organizations, attended community events, and appeared in media interviews not only to keep Phoenix's story alive but also to highlight the broader inequalities that her case exemplified. In doing so, they turned personal tragedy into public advocacy. Phoenix's disappearance became more than a mystery to be solved. It became a symbol of the urgent need for change in how missing persons cases are handled and reported. Through their persistence, the Coldons ensured that their daughter's name would not be forgotten, and that other families might benefit from the attention and resources that had eluded them for so long. The legacy of this renewed spotlight was twofold. On one level, Phoenix's case became widely known among true crime audiences, transforming from a little-covered local story into one recognized nationally. On another level, it became a case study in systemic disparities, raising questions about law enforcement priorities, media responsibility, and the challenges faced by families searching for missing loved ones. For Lawrence and Goldia, the mission remains unchanged. They want answers. They want to know what happened to their daughter on that cold December day in 2011, why her SUV was found abandoned with her belongings inside, and why the trail grew cold so quickly. They want justice, or at the very least, the truth. Until then, they refuse to be silent. In the years since Phoenix Coldon vanished, the case has settled uneasily into a liminal space, one where speculation thrives but certainty refuses to emerge. Investigators have combed through tips, chased leads, and revisited testimony, yet the same disturbing facts remain unchanged. A young woman, vibrant and full of potential, drove away from her home one December afternoon. Hours later, her SUV was discovered abandoned, still running in a location that raised more questions than answers. Her purse, shoes, and identification were inside. But Phoenix herself had vanished, leaving behind silence that no amount of searching has managed to break. This unyielding mystery has left the community, and especially her family, suspended between hope and despair. Every parent's instinct is to protect, to fight, to bring their child home no matter the cost. For Lawrence and Goldia Coldon, that instinct has been their only constant since December 2011. They have poured their strength into keeping Phoenix's story alive, refusing to let her name fade into the background noise of thousands of other unresolved disappearances. Yet, despite their persistence, Phoenix's case has underscored an uncomfortable truth about how society treats missing persons cases differently. The Coldons have spoken openly about what they see as disparities, how young black women often don't receive the same level of urgency, media coverage, or sustained attention as others in similar situations. This reality has become part of Phoenix's legacy. Her story is not only about a young woman gone missing, but also about a system that seems to fall short when families like hers cry out for answers. The family's efforts have reached far beyond their own tragedy. They have participated in documentaries, raised awareness on social platforms, and spoken at events focused on missing persons. Each time they share Phoenix's story, it is with the hope that someone somewhere might recognize a detail, remember an encounter, or finally speak up with information that could change everything. Awareness, after all, is sometimes the last tool families have when official investigations stall. The 2018 Oxygen documentary The Disappearance of Phoenix Coldon brought her story to a wider audience. For the Coldons, it was both a relief and a painful reminder. Relief, because their daughter's name was finally reaching households across the nation. Painful, because it also reminded them how long they had been fighting largely on their own. While the program reignited interest and spurred fresh conversations, it did not produce the resolution they so desperately seek. The SUV, the belongings inside, the silence that followed, none of these pieces have shifted into a coherent picture. This lingering uncertainty keeps the Coldons in a space most people could never imagine enduring. Without remains, there is no closure. Without credible sightings, there is no hope of reunion. Without confessions or concrete leads, there is only speculation. Did Phoenix encounter foul play shortly after leaving home? Did she fall victim to traffickers, as her parents and many advocates fear? Or did she choose to walk away, overwhelmed by personal struggles she kept hidden even from those closest to her? Each possibility carries its own weight, and none can be fully dismissed. What makes this story particularly haunting is how ordinary the beginning of it was. Phoenix wasn't preparing for a trip, or meeting with strangers, or leaving for an unknown destination. She stepped out of her driveway like countless others do each day, and within hours her world, and her family's, had fractured permanently. It's a reminder that disappearances don't always begin with dramatic circumstances. Sometimes they begin with routine moments, interrupted suddenly by forces invisible until it's too late. For Lawrence and Goldia, every anniversary of that December day is another reminder that their daughter is still out there, somewhere, and that their fight must continue. They have turned their pain into advocacy, determined not just to find Phoenix but also to shine a light on all the other families still searching. In interviews, Goldia has said she wants people to understand that Phoenix is not just a statistic. She was a real person with dreams, struggles, and a family who loves her. That truth fuels their determination to speak her name again and again, until the silence finally breaks. The case also forces us as a society to confront hard questions. How many other Phoenixes are out there? How many families are waiting, without the benefit of national headlines or dedicated investigative specials? And what responsibility do we all share in making sure those voices are not drowned out by indifference or overshadowed by cases deemed more media-worthy? These are not comfortable questions, but they are ones Phoenix's story demands we face. And now, more than a decade later, Phoenix Coldon remains missing. Her SUV was found. Her belongings were there. But she was not. There has been no confirmed trace of her since that day. The facts are as chilling today as they were in 2011. What happened to Phoenix? Who holds the answers that could finally end her parents' torment? Why has no one, after all these years, stepped forward with information that could bring closure? This is where the story becomes ours too. Because while investigators and the family continue their search, awareness rests with the public. Each person who learns Phoenix's name, who shares her story, who remembers her face, they keep her alive in ways that official files cannot. That collective memory is sometimes the only thing that prevents cold cases from freezing over completely. And so, we turn to you. Do you believe Phoenix's disappearance was the result of foul play? Do you think she may have been targeted for trafficking? Or do you see signs that she may have chosen to start a new life elsewhere? What theory seems most plausible to you, and why do you think the truth has remained hidden for so long? Share your thoughts in the comments, not just as speculation but as part of keeping Phoenix's name alive. Each discussion, each question, is part of ensuring she is not forgotten. Your comments help keep Phoenix's story alive. Subscribe to the Cold Case Archive and turn on notifications so you never miss a case we cover. Because every case matters. Every name matters. And until the day Phoenix Coldon is found, her story remains unfinished. This has been the Cold Case Archive. Thank you for joining us as we preserve these stories one file at a time. Don't forget to like and share, so that the memory of these cases lives on.